So earlier today, Nick Caserio was on KILT, and he was asked whether or not David Culley will be back next season. And the Texans general manager said his focus is on getting ready for the Seahawks this weekend. His quote, "I'm not going to make any comment on what's going to happen after the season." Let me just say this. If David Culley was a lock to come back, you know what the answer would have been there? Yes, David Culley's our coach. The fact that he left it open-ended, the fact that he didn't exactly, give a vote of confidence to a head coach that he personally hired, I think the conversation about David Culley being one and done, even with that win over the Titans, and they wouldn't end the year on that 16-game losing streak after winning week one, I think it's fair to have that conversation once again when the Texans general manager who handpicked the coach is not voicing that the coach will definitely be back for year two.
Feels like those conversations have already started because there's nothing wrong with giving a coach a vote of confidence, having him finish out the year and have those results determine if you keep that vote of confidence. Mm-hmm. You can back your guy up. You can support your guy and change your mind before the end of the season or after the end of the season.
Happens all the time.
Like, you would not be a liar if you were the general manager of the Texans and you said, David Culley is our head coach and we expect him to be our head coach next season. And then change your mind after the rest of the season plays out. Like, you could absolutely do that. It was perhaps the most notable aspect of the conversation that he would not back his hand-picked head coach, who is really, and we had the conversation weeks ago, and we should be having the conversation going forward, in danger of losing his job.
It's great news, honestly. I loved not hearing that from Nick Caserio. I loved not getting that vote of confidence from Nick Caserio today. I mean, David Culley's awful. He's one of, if not the worst NFL head coaches I've ever seen. I mean, he's on the level of Bobby Petrino or Jim Tom Sula. You could even go back to Dave Campo if you really wanted to. I mean, this guy has done nothing that tells me he can be a head coach at this level. I'm going to ask you guys, what tells you that he should be back? What have you seen from David Culley over the first 12 games of this season that tells you he can be, forget a good head coach in the NFL, but an adequate head coach in the NFL? Because I have seen nothing. I think he's the worst in-game coach I have ever seen, and he's already told us, and multiple people within the organization have told us, that he doesn't have a whole lot of say in the game planning leading up to the games as well. So what tells you that David Culley should be brought back for another year?
Well, he's such a nice guy, BK. I mean, he's such a nice guy. Look, I like David Culley, the person, but we can't couch our opinions with he's a great guy. Yeah. Yes, he's a great guy. He's getting paid a lot of money to be an NFL head coach. He gets to live out that dream. I'm very happy he has this opportunity. But the reality is, you're right. I mean, the guy had never been a coordinator for a reason, and here we are. And you give him the benefit of the doubt. You want to see how things play out. My biggest issue with the Texans is not that they're losing; it's the way they're losing. It's the lack of adjustments. It's the fact that David Culley continues to tell us they're running the ball well, or he's telling us there's no issues with the game plan. So he's not good at the press conference. He's not good at designing a game plan. And let's be real, he didn't hire Lovie Smith, who's been the best coach that's been on this staff. So if they wanted to make a change at coach, I wouldn't blame them for doing that. But I would say this to Nick Caserio: you hired him, and you gave him a terrible team, or you inherited a terrible team. So be ready for the backlash from folks nationally that you hired a minority head coach and you're canning him after 1 year, because that's a legitimate conversation that is going to be had if they fire David Culley and just give him 1 year with a roster that we all looked at and said, yeah, this team's going to be one of the worst in the NFL.
I want to go back to something BK said, and then I want to talk about what you said, Jake. BK, you mentioned Jim Tom Sula, you mentioned Dave Campo, and you mentioned Bobby Petrino. Bobby Petrino, highly successful college football head coach.
Yep.
Jim Tom Sula, highly successful defensive line coach in the National Football League. Mm-hmm. A defensive coach. And then Dave Campo had success coaching defense in the National Football League.
Yeah, all those guys were either coordinators or head coaches before getting their jobs as head coaches.
David Culley was the wide receivers coach for a wide receiver group that went an entire season without catching a touchdown. David Culley was a quarterback coach the year Josh Allen had his worst year ever as a professional quarterback. Now, it was his rookie year, but it was real bad. Okay, it wasn't good. And then Allen got significantly better in the years post David Culley. David Culley was the passing game coordinator last season, or assisted in the passing game, for one of the worst passing offenses in football, in the Baltimore Ravens. So David Culley didn't even have a resume to point to the success to get to this. Like, David Culley's here as a people manager, and that's the tough part, is it goes to that imaginary culture meter that sits outside NRG Stadium. Oh, wait, there's not an imaginary culture meter that sits outside because you can't measure culture. You can't measure how nice of a guy David Culley is to the players. You can't measure how much the locker room likes the guy because we don't talk to the players, and no players walking up to the podium saying, yeah, I don't like David Culley. And, oh, by the way, the guys that do like him probably like him because they want to keep a job in the National Football League, okay? And then, Jake, what you talked about, Nick Caserio did not have to give David Culley this roster. He didn't. Now, I'm not saying this Texans roster was in good shape if he had just stayed the course and acted like, okay, we have the same team, we're going to operate the same way, and just slide in Tyrod Taylor in for Deshaun Watson. But if he had done that and you wanted to get a sense of where the team was at that moment, you could have understood like, oh, okay, yeah, like actually what he took over was just not very good. Like it wasn't just Bill O'Brien and a season of chaos in 2020 that led to a team that was in the playoffs in 2019 falling apart. Like this team just actually wasn't very good. No, Nick Caserio stripped the thing down and purposely put this team out there. So he hired a guy to get fired by putting this team under the guy's control.
If he fires him. And that then, begs the question. So if you're going to hire a guy and then get rid of him after 1 year, you made a mistake hiring him in the first place. You can't justify the hire. Now, if Caserio thinks it's so bad and he wants to admit he made that type of mistake, okay, that's fine. I understand why he would do that. But just know, how many more head coaches does this guy get to pick? Like, he gets probably one more. If you're a GM, you usually don't get to pick more than just 2 coaches. He would already be on his second coach, year 2 on the job. It's a bad look. If he wants to deal with the backlash and he thinks this is the only way to go about it, then do it. But just know, if you hire David Culley, give him a bad roster, and even though he does look in over his head, even though we can nitpick watching every game, things he doesn't do well, just know there will be significant backlash, and a lot of people saying, why should we think Nick Caserio knows what he's doing if he got rid of a head coach after just 1 year?
Yeah, that's fair. I'd be more mad if he brought David Culley back, though, because David Culley is clearly inept. And we've seen this in the NFL recently where a team fired a head coach after 1 year, and the next guy they brought in was the right guy for the job. It's the Arizona Cardinals, the team with the best record in the NFL right now. They had Steve Wilks as their head coach for 1 year. He went 3-13. He looked in over his head. Not as in over his head as David Culley looks, but he looked in over his head. They make a move. They bring in Cliff Kingsbury, and here they are just a couple of years later, sitting at 10-2, the number 1 seed in the NFC right now. Like, there is a way to make that happen, and coaching matters in the NFL. Bill Belichick says it all the time. Good players can't overcome bad coaching. Am I saying the Texans have a bunch of good players right now? No, but when they do get good players, I have no faith that David Culley can be a good coach. I don't think good talent can overcome a coach as bad as David Culley. So there is nothing I've seen from him this year. I was going to ask y'all to give me 2 redeeming qualities he had. I figured you guys would both say he's nice, then y'all would be searching for a second one. There's no second redeeming quality for David Culley. He just hasn't done anything, and I like that Nick Caserio is kind of distancing himself from David Culley. I agree with you, Jake. People are going to be upset because that was Nick Caserio's move to bring him in, but I think it would be worse to bring him back for another year and just say, we're perfectly comfortable with this crap coach being here another season versus taking the bad optical look of having a one-and-done head coach.
I think the Steve Keim situation is really important to take a look at as a recipe for making it eventually work. You got to think about the situation that Steve Keim was in. He got rid of Bruce Arians a few years into Bruce Arians' tenure, and Arians was kind of wrapping up what we thought was his NFL career. He goes to Steve Wilks, and then after a year, he goes to Cliff Kingsbury. In the meantime, Steve Keim had a very embarrassing situation for the Arizona Cardinals where he got a DUI on the 4th of July, which is a very it's easy to like you should not drink and drive ever, and you shouldn't even take a risk on the 4th of July.
One of those no refusal days.
Yeah, so you're a big dumbass if you get a DUI, and then you're an even bigger dumbass if you get it on one of those no refusal weekends. So Keim had an embarrassing situation, but it started to work out because he's picked a bunch of good players, he signed a bunch of good players, and he's put this Arizona Cardinals roster together to a point where they're the best team in the NFC right now. So Keim is a great example of, you might get to pick that third one, but you got to nail it in a lot of other aspects of your job, and Nick Caserio hasn't done that yet, and maybe you can argue he hasn't had the opportunity to yet, but he certainly hasn't nailed it in the rest.
Totally agree. And I'm not against them going down that path, but just know my faith in Caserio being a good GM takes a hit if you're moving on from a head coach after 1 year. You got to show me that you know what you're doing, because year one's an abject failure if you hired a coach and then you got rid of him after just 1 year. How many coaches do you get if you're Nick Caserio?